here we are. This is Sex Love Psychedelics, and I'm your host, Dr. Kat. Bringing you psychosexual conversations that will leave you intellectually turned on and hungry for more.
You described it in stages, and the first one was around feeling. Can you guide our audience through what these stages were? I felt like you organized it so beautifully.
Yes. So I get them in order. I'm going to actually just read them to you because I have it right here.
Yeah. Well, while you do that, I just want to share with the audience the importance of this. What I saw in how you organized it in this way was both helping to share with them it is a process.
Yes.
It is a layered process, and it's not going to be delivered in one psychedelic experience or
Yes.
in every format of psychedelic experience, and to even be with and be present and celebrate what you do get out of that one. Even if we label it as minimal, it's probably profound in the grand scheme of things.
Oh, I think that the point that you're making kind of expands out in so many directions. So I'll share with the listeners just what the stages are.
Beautiful.
And the way I wrote them, I'm not reading from the book, but I'm just going to tell you the list of them. And
Sure.
It's feeling, witnessing, accepting, releasing, embodiment, and the restoration of pleasure. And I can say something very brief about each of them and then sort of speak to the point that you're making. So when we think about our healing work, whether it's in traditional psychotherapy or psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, or let me be even more broad, our psychedelic healing work in general, because I think therapy is one venue for trauma healing, but so are community-based contexts, so are ceremonial contexts. And I think no matter what intentional context we use for our psychedelic healing, what feels safe to us, which is really going to depend from person to person and their social location and their previous trauma history. I think that these are fairly universal experiences that go along with the healing of trauma. The feeling piece of it is that psychedelics and trauma therapy, it just might move a little more slowly in trauma therapy, but in psychedelic work, it kind of gets more energized, that we can have the experience of feeling feelings that were long avoided, that we have not wanted to engage with. And I think different psychedelic medicines help us in distinctly different ways to do that. Some of them can really amplify the feelings. And so the experience itself might be very, very difficult to go through, but we feel at the end of it that we've released and processed something that's really valuable to us. Other psychedelic medicines might actually help us to feel a sense of euphoria, which allows us to look at and process really, really difficult material that would otherwise be intolerable to feel in our bodies. So one way or the other, different medicines heal in different ways, and they can help us with this process of feeling. The next is witnessing, which I think is really interesting, because if you are sitting with a therapist or a guide and you are going through some sort of process of healing trauma through either an intellectual meaning-making process or a somatic process, which, I think is actually a layer of healing that has kind of more roots for our life, can be more productive for our life. Sometimes that witness is a person. It's a trusted guide. It's a therapist who's actually holding the space for us. So we are seen in our grief, we are seen in our pain, and we are still loved. And I use the word love very intentionally because sitting and witnessing the grief and pain of another person is loving them as a verb. So therapists, we shy away from this word because it can be so charged. So we may not be sitting there telling our clients, I love you, in that kind of explicit language because it can be misunderstood. Maybe we should more, right? Maybe we should normalize that more. I'm not going to touch that point just now. I understand why we don't, but loving them is actually holding that space for them. With psychedelic work, I think is so fascinating is that witnessing can also happen by our ancestors, by the spirits of the medicine in themselves that so many people experience within the psychedelic context. The next piece is accepting, and accepting is that on some fundamental level, you have to be able to say, this is what happened to me. this is what happened to me, right? And I make that emphasis in sort of the second repeating of that phrase because I have worked with so many trauma survivors that feel as though this thing happened and it affects them, but because of dissociation, because of the life they've lived trying to maintain since then, it feels as though it were somebody else.
Oh,
And
yeah, totally.
accepting that this happened to me
Hmm.
can be a very big part of kind of moving forward with our healing.
Hmm.
Releasing, I think, is also a really a fascinating process because if we're working somatically, we understand that the body is healing something that has to go, even if we're not consciously thinking about it. And not to be too long-winded about it, but one of the things about psychedelic work that I find fascinating is that I've worked with many survivors and have had this experience myself where you might be shaking, crying, purging, yelling, and it's not as if you're thinking about a memory of trauma, but when the experience is over, your body has cleared something that you didn't even know needed to go. So I think the releasing can be the literal somatic work of healing trauma, but it can also mean these kinds of releases of energy that happen that are just helped along by the medicine because that's intentionally what it does. And that brings us to these last phases, which I think are the ones that get completely overlooked in psychedelic assisted therapy in the medical model and overlooked by a lot of therapists too, which is how do we come back to our bodies? How do we actually learn to feel, learn for that to be safe, and learn to step onto a path where pleasure becomes a practice in our lives, not only because we deserve it, but because it's actually necessary for us to be self-actualized beings in this world.
Yeah, yeah, and it's such a rebellious act in this society that tells us not to trust our bodies, not to be in our bodies. Our bodies are wrong. Don't trust the signals of our bodies, you know. It just so to be a rebel of that, it actually takes these stages, these steps, and each of them so important,
Yeah.
you know, for the next.
And I'll make one brief comment because I know that was a lot that I just said. I will add like one brief addendum to this. Trauma can be really tricky
Yeah.
because when we have experienced trauma, our bodies are often giving us signals that are very hard to interpret.
Hmm.
Trauma makes us feel that things are unsafe when they're not, that people are unsafe when they're not, that unsafe people are safe. Learning to trust what you feel is also a really big part of the healing process.
Well, that was fun. Thanks for tuning in, lovers. And if you want to experience more ecstasy and sexual liberation, head over to sexlovepsychedelics.com and learn about how you can join me for any one of my online or live events. And while you're there, grab my free guide on sex and psychedelics. Remember, this podcast is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Please contact your healthcare provider and local law before pursuing any of the products or psychedelics discussed. And one final note here. I make this show specifically for you. If you're loving the show, then be sure to leave me a review in iTunes or Spotify to let me know. Happy to be here and happy to serve. I'll see you next time on Sex Love Psychedelics.